Welcome back to Module 2 of 1016 MSc, the Muscular System. This is the last of the mini lectures for this module, covering topic 2.5b. We will be discussing the physiology of muscle contraction. Open your workbook to Module 2, topic 2.5, and see if you can answer some of the questions that relate to the content covered during this mini lecture. The learning outcomes for topic 2.5b are to be able to define a motor unit, outline the difference between hypertrophy and hyperplasia with respect to skeletal muscle enlargement, briefly describe 3 biochemical pathways for skeletal muscle to generate ATP, and name 3 types of muscle fibres and describe how they rely on different cellular processes to obtain ATP. What is a motor unit? A motor unit is the motor nerve or motor neuron and all of the muscle fibres that the motor neuron innervates. All muscle fibres are innervated by one motor neuron, but one motor neuron may branch and innervate many muscle fibres. Motor units are all different sizes. Some motor units may only innervate 4 fibres, whereas other motor units may innervate 300 muscle fibres. Large motor units innervate a large number of muscle fibres. An example of this is the quadriceps muscle in the thigh. The quadriceps is a large muscle that creates a lot of power. Smaller motor units innervate a small number of muscle fibres. Smaller motor units are used for very small, delicate movements, such as those executed by the fingers during manipulative tasks. So, large motor units are utilized for their strength, and small motor units are used for fine control. What might affect muscle contraction? There are 4 main factors. Recruitment of motor units. The size principle states that the smallest motor units will be recruited first, producing small forces. Progressively, larger motor units are recruited to produce larger forces. If the stimulus is small, only a few motor units will be recruited to activate the muscle. However, in the case of a bigger stimulus, or action potential, a larger number of units will be recruited to provide a greater contractile force. The size of the muscle fibres. Large muscle fibres will produce more tension and therefore a more forceful contraction. Regular resistance exercise can increase the size of a muscle and therefore the force it can produce. Additionally, increasing the frequency of the stimulus will cause a muscle to produce a greater force. This is because there is more calcium surrounding the muscle fibre, already available to participate in the next cross-bridge cycle, producing the next contraction. Each time the muscle contracts, it doesn't always fully relax, but instead builds or piggybacks on the last one. This process is called the Treppe effect. The strength of the stimulus will also affect the force of contraction. The greater the strength of the stimulus, the greater the force output. And the last factor to affect muscle contraction is the degree of muscle stretch. If a muscle is stretched to its optimum before contraction, which is slightly beyond its resting length, it will result in a more forceful contraction. Think about the overlapping of actin and myosin in the sarcomeres. If a muscle is stretched so much that there is no overlap of the filaments, the myosin heads have nothing to attach to and can't generate tension. On the other hand, if the sarcomeres are so compressed that the thin filaments interfere with each other, very little shortening can occur. Ideally, the muscle should be slightly stretched so that actin and myosin overlap, but there is room for more cross-bridge formation to occur and more forceful tension to develop. So how does exercise affect our muscles? Aerobic exercise improves oxygen delivery and utilization. With training, more capillaries develop around the muscle fibres, making delivery of the oxygen optimal. Aerobic exercise develops more mitochondria in the cells and myoglobin, which is a protein that carries oxygen in the muscle cell, increases. All in all, aerobic training leads to more efficient muscle metabolism. An example of aerobic exercise is long-distance running or endurance sports. Resistance exercise is more high intensity. It doesn't build stamina, but it does build strength and increase the size of the muscles. Hypertrophy refers to an increase in the size of individual muscle fibres, not the number of individual muscle fibres. The muscle fibres split a little bit and they branch out. There are more myofilaments, more myofibrils, and connective tissue within those muscle cells, which result in them becoming larger. Hyperplasia refers to an increase in cell number, not cell size. This may occur, for example, as a result of a neoplasm or a tumorous growth, but does not occur as a result of resistance exercise. Atrophy of a muscle means it gets smaller in size, and this often happens if it's not used. You've heard of the saying, if you don't use it, you lose it. That's muscle atrophy. At the end of the day, any exercise is better than none. Sitting in front of the computer reviewing your online lectures develops a sedentary lifestyle. You need to get up and take a break and come to the tutorials. What types of muscle contraction are there? Muscle tone relates to the underlying tension within the muscle that exists even at rest. If a muscle contracts and there is a change in length of the muscle, this is called an isotonic contraction. Isotonic refers to a change in length of the muscle, but the tension remains the same. Muscles can change in length in two different ways. They can shorten or they can lengthen during an isotonic contraction. If we use a sit-up as an example, our abdominal muscles shorten during the sit-up, so this is a concentric contraction. However, as we lay back down again, our muscles are still under tension, but the muscle is lengthening, not shortening. This is an eccentric contraction. Often, the eccentric contractions cause micro tears in the muscle fibre, which can result in some delayed muscle soreness after exercise. Both concentric and eccentric contractions are types of isotonic contractions. The muscle shortens or lengthens, while tension is maintained. An isometric contraction does not change muscle length during the contraction, even though tension is developed. The myofilaments do bind and form cross bridges and create tension, but they do not slide past each other, so the muscle neither shortens nor lengthens. An isometric contraction occurs if the load is greater than the force the muscle is able to develop. For example, trying to lift a car with one hand would create an isometric contraction in the biceps muscle. ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is the only energy source used directly for contractile activities of a muscle. Where do muscles get their ATP? ATP production powers the sliding filaments as well as the calcium pumps and also the sodium-potassium pumps. So, skeletal muscle utilizes and needs a lot of ATP to be produced. ATP production is vital because muscles store very limited reserves. There are 3 different processes by which ATP is regenerated during skeletal muscle contraction. These include direct phosphorylation of ADP by creatine phosphate, anaerobic glycolysis, and aerobic respiration. As soon as we begin to exercise, the small amount of ATP that is stored in muscle is utilized within a few twitches. Creatine phosphate, a high-energy molecule present in muscles, then regenerates ATP by transferring a phosphate group from creatine phosphate to ATP to create one molecule of ATP energy. This reaction takes place in the presence of creatine kinase, an enzyme that removes the phosphate molecule from creatine phosphate and adds it to ADP. As long as we have enough creatine kinase, we can produce these molecules of ATP. Secondly, an alternative process is the anaerobic pathway called glycolysis. Glucose arrives from the blood or is stored as glycogen in the muscles. It can be broken down to produce glucose and then undergoes a stepwise process that produces pyruvic acid and 2 ATP molecules. This happens in all muscles when there is no oxygen available and only produces a little bit of energy. In addition to ATP, pyruvic acid is also produced. If there is no oxygen around to utilize the pyruvic acid, it gets converted into lactic acid and is released into the blood, where it might contribute to muscle soreness. The third process by which we produce 38 molecules of ATP is in the presence of oxygen. This is called aerobic metabolism, or aerobic cellular respiration. Glucose and pyruvic acid and fatty acids and amino acids all come into the mitochondria and can be converted to ATP. But the one thing that is necessary for this process to occur is oxygen. This is aerobic respiration. So, in the first instance, for about the first 15 seconds of exercise, creatine phosphate is utilized to produce energy. If the exercise bout is a little bit longer, we need to utilize a different system, and this is glycolysis. Up to about 60 seconds of vigorous exercise utilizes the stored ATP, plus the creatine phosphate and glycolysis. However, any exercise bout longer than about 1 minute will utilize aerobic respiration, requiring oxygen for the production of energy. The muscles that require glycolysis for energy production produce a huge amount of force, whereas the muscles that are utilized in aerobic respiration are used more for endurance activities and produce less force. This slide gives a nice revision of these 3 processes utilized for creating energy for muscle contraction. The first few seconds of vigorous exercise, for example, during a sprint, utilizes the stored ATP molecules within the muscle. Beyond this, for up to 10 seconds of exercise, ATP is formed from creatine phosphate and ADP in the process of direct phosphorylation. If the exercise continues up to about a minute, glycogen stored in muscles is broken down to produce glucose in a process called anaerobic glycolysis. And finally, during prolonged duration exercise, for example going on a long run or bike ride, ATP is generated via the breakdown of several nutrient energy sources in the presence of oxygen via the aerobic pathway. This slide shows the different fibre types that are present within a muscle. FO stands for fast oxidative, pink-coloured fibres. SO are slow oxidative, red-coloured fibres. And FG are the fast glycolytic fibres, or white fibres seen in a muscle cell. The colour of these muscle fibre types indicates the type of energy utilisation. Fast glycolytic fibres rely mostly on ATP to give them their energy. They rely on glycolysis, and they are white as they don't have a lot of capillaries surrounding them, and therefore no oxygen to provide their energy. They are bigger, wider fibres that provide greater force. The slow oxidative fibres are red. They have lots of myoglobin, which is an oxygen-carrying molecule, and lots of capillaries, so they utilize oxygen to provide energy for endurance. The pink-colored muscle fibres lie in between, as they share some of the characteristics of the other two muscle fibre types. They are the fast oxidative muscle fibres. A sprinter would have a higher proportion of fast glycolytic fibres, whereas a marathon runner would have a higher proportion of slow oxidative fibres. So white fibres are fast twitch glycolytic and are fatigable. Red fibres are slow oxidative and fatigue resistant. In between, we have pink fibres that are fast oxidative. Different combinations are recruited for different actions or activities. Fast glycolytic fibres increase contractile velocity, whereas the slow oxidative fibres increase contractile duration. If only a small load is required to be lifted, a proportion of both fibres will be utilized. Usain Bolt, world champion sprinter, can complete the 100-meter sprint in 9.58 seconds. He would utilize any stored ATP and then phosphorylate creatine phosphate to produce enough energy for his sprint. Which fibre type is Bolt likely to have a higher proportion of? A higher proportion of fast glycolytic fibres are likely to be found in his calf muscles. Deadlift king Eddie Hall is a world record holder and able to lift a whopping 462 kilograms. In this short burst, high-intensity exercise, Eddie would also utilize any stored ATP and phosphorylate creatine phosphate. Limi Hale of Ethiopia won the Boston Marathon in 2 hours 12 minutes, running for 42.2 kilometers. This would require aerobic respiration to produce enough energy for muscle contraction. Hale is likely to have a higher proportion of slow oxidative muscle fibers in his calves. The really important concepts to understand from this table are the characteristics that separate the different fiber types. Speed of contraction and myosin ATPase activity are what makes fast glycolytic fibers fast and slow oxidative fibers slow. ATPase is the enzyme that breaks that cross-bridge cycle so we can continue to contract faster. The primary pathway of ATP synthesis relates to whether or not the process utilizes oxygen. Thus, slow oxidative and fast oxidative fibers produce ATP via aerobic respiration, and fast glycolytic fibers produce ATP via anaerobic glycolysis in the absence of oxygen. Speed of contraction and the primary pathway of ATP synthesis is important to note here. If you can associate the structural features to suit the function, you will have already learned everything on this table. Have a look at these review questions. Now that you have completed this mini lecture on muscle physiology, try to answer these questions in your workbook before coming along to the tutorial. We will discuss your answers then. You have now completed Module 2, the muscular system. Remember to complete your online quiz before coming to the tutorial this week.